This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to this series of special episodes of AI Group's DBrief podcast. DBrief is designed to give you insights into the impact of policy on your business. In these mini episodes, we'll be talking about the kinds of policies we want to see for members in the upcoming federal election. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group. And today I have Brent Ferguson, AI Group's Head of Workplace Relations Policy, giving us a rundown of his pre-election policy paper. Hi, Brent.
Hi, Louise.
So get us started. What's the problem we're trying to solve?
Well, Australia's workplace relations system really has been the subject of significant concern for industry for many years. There are various aspects of the system that industry are not content with, but the overarching perspective of employers is that it is notoriously complex. It's highly prescriptive and restrictive for industry. And there's a real view that it's not setting us up for success in the future or for navigating the challenges ahead. We could spend a lot of talk about all the specific problems with it. But really the view is that it certainly isn't helping us tackle our problems around productivity and efficiency, as well as a raft of other challenges we're going to face.
So, as I said, digitalisation, decarbonisation, diversification, there is a lot of media around the impact of AI in workplaces and the future of jobs and what happens to some jobs as they transition. Does the system support us at the moment in having that conversation?
Well, yeah. There are lots of restrictions around how employers manage things that change in the workplace, in our highly prescriptive system. And that's why, in part, we are arguing that there needs to be much greater flexibility in our workplace laws. Changes that make it easier for employers and employees to agree on how work is actually undertaken at the workplace level, and that will enable them to, capitalise on some of those changes. But really, on the whole, our system, does have appropriate safeguards, if you will, for how we manage the move to new technologies. But certainly, the development of AI is a concern for many in the union movement. And that is, I suppose, an emerging area of the union's agenda. And I expect, in the election and in the years to come, that will be an area that unions do focus on, saying that there needs to be reform. From our perspective, we're not of the view that there does need to be any sort of new restrictions imposed upon those things. It's really about how do we let employers and employees agree on how to utilise those arrangements.
So I've heard our CEO, Ines Willox, say at a number of forums that the real risk for a lot of employees is not so much the adoption of AI, but that companies don't adopt it, don't invest in that new technology, and in fact the businesses just don't survive. I think we've got to really provide that environment to encourage companies to make that investment. Now, you also talk a lot about complexity in your paper and the regulatory burden that places on companies, which, has, as you say, an impact on productivity. What can we do to unpack some of that complexity?
Well, really the system is a notorious minefield of technicalities, which employers, are just struggling to get to terms with in the context of there being successive waves of further changes over recent years, which have just made it harder for business to operate. As I said, we could spend a lot of time talking about a raft of sensible amendments that really need to be made to try and tackle this issue. But I suppose we've provided an overarching approach to what should be done in order to start to grapple with these issues. And then we've called out sort of 5 specific areas that are screaming out for attention. But if I talk firstly about that overarching approach, our first view is that the system really needs a comprehensive review in order to identify sensible, meaningful improvements that can be made to it. Our current federal legislation, the Fair Work Act, was introduced in 2009 by a Labor government. Since then, it's really been subject to sort of piecemeal change, largely by successive Labor governments that have, added to the problems in the system. We think it's at a point now where we need a fundamental review on what the cumulative impact of those changes has been and whether it's still fit for purpose, and that review should underpin the identification of changes. Now, I would flag that there is a review underway at the moment, and there's going to be a further review in 2005, but they're only focused on some of the minor amendments or some of the specific amendments that have been made. They're not looking comprehensively at the system, and we don't hold out much hope for them identifying suitable ways forward.
And is this because we're not taking that overall view of the entire system, that we're just fixing piecemeal?
Well, that's right. So this review that's currently underway and the ones that will be underway later this year, early next year, were reviews that the government agreed to as part of the concessions it needed to make to get its last tranches of IR reforms through. And as a result, they're really only directed at looking at those legislative amendments. They're not looking holistically at what the cumulative impact of the changes are or how the system more broadly is operating. And that's what we need to do. The other reality is that if we look at the draft report from the first review that's been released, it's very underwhelming. The reviewers have largely taken the view that, well, it's very early days following the implementation of the changes. It's not clear what the impacts are, so they've refrained from making many substantive suggestions. So we'll see where that review gets to at the end of this month, but we're not holding out much hope for that identifying many substantial improvements. It's fairly underwhelming.
And in terms of some of the specific measures that you call out, I know one's defining a casual. What sort of impact is that having on our members?
Well, as you suggest, one of the impacts or one of the areas that we think really needs to be looked at is a reconsideration of the changes to the definition of casual employment, and indeed, separately a change to the definition of who is an employee. Both of those were fundamental changes to our workplace relations system. They were really radical changes that were pushed through. If I look specifically at that definition of casual employment, there is now on any assessment, very complex definition of who is a casual employee under the legislation. And it's a departure from the way it was conceived of, for a very long time. And it's a narrowing of who can be defined as a casual. It effectively makes it harder for an employer to bring somebody on as a casual employee. Now, I think over time that will result in less opportunities being created for casual workers, and that will be a restriction on kinds of flexibility that in reality have suited both employers and many casual employees. But really, at the moment, the immediate impact that's having is just it's creating uncertainty for employers. People are struggling with what that change actually means in practice and what they have to do in order to ensure that they remain compliant with it. And we think that does need to be reconsidered. It was certainly a retrograde change to what the situation was. The other change I'll just come to, Louise, is that definition of who is an employee as opposed to a contractor. It sounds, like a pretty fundamental point, but that is an area where there's been just a dramatic change, and it's, again, raised significant uncertainty for industry about whether or not they can continue to utilise contracting arrangements that they've been utilising very successfully for years to come. And I think, again, industry is just grappling with what does this actually mean in practice. And I think we're yet to see the full impact of that play out, but it has certainly resulted in very significant and entirely unnecessary uncertainty being created.
Yeah. Well, and of course, all sorts of employers use contractors, casuals, as a way to flex as the market changes, as their products change. So it really does have an impact on productivity, entrepreneurship, and ultimately, as you say, creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses. So what's another big area that we hope to have some change in?
Well, one of the areas that, I think really needs to be tackled is the notorious complexity, of the system as a whole, but in particular, our modern award system. Now, employers have been, frankly, for a very long time, crying out for the need for some genuine simplification of our system of awards, modern awards as they're referred to. They are lengthy documents that, many employers frankly struggle to decipher. And in our views, we need to take some concrete steps to simplify those, to make some of the rules around how we undertake work at the workplace level simpler and more flexible. We have highly restrictive provisions, getting into details around precise times when people will have drink breaks and so forth, that, these things go on for hundreds of pages. And the truth is, their complexity is a big part of the reason why there is, often non-compliance with workplace laws. We have seen this government, the previous governments, double down on penalties for non-compliance, and nobody is trying to justify deliberate non-compliance. But we haven't tackled the root causes of this, and one of those is, just how hard it is to understand and accurately apply these modern awards. And we say it's high time that we grappled with that issue.
And so is one of the results or sort of demonstrations of that complexity is a lot of these high profile pay disputes or non-compliance, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've seen, high profile media reports of, employers underpaying staff at times or not complying with these instruments. But when you scratch the surface, rarely is it a consequence of employers deliberately flagrantly disregarding those laws. More often than not, when you work with employers, it is because there's been some sort of mistake on the interpretation of the award, and that's over time developed into a significant issue. Now, again, we're not in any way condoning non-compliance with these laws, but the complexity of the system is part of the problem. And if we want to rectify this, just, continually looking for a bigger stick to sort of beat employers with isn't going to be the solution. We've got wage theft laws, they're through, but we haven't done enough to try and make it easier for employers to try and meet their requirements in terms of understanding their requirements. That's the part of the puzzle that's missing.
Yeah, we really need systemic change just to improve compliance overall. Now, you also call out reforming the building construction sector. As a Victorian, we've been watching with horror all these stories coming out with CFMEU and its impact on the big build. But what can we ask the government, the future government, to do in this area?
Look, obviously the media reports, have put into sharp focus fairly disgraceful conduct that's been going on in the building industry. Frankly, they're not a shock to many in this industry who've known about these problems for a long time. The problems in the sector, again, have been, repeatedly acknowledged through royal commissions and court cases. They are notorious. Now, the government has taken action by putting the CFMEU into administration. From our perspective, that is only a first step. And it should only have ever been regarded as a first step. Now, there is concern in industry that the actions of the administrator are, again, disappointing and somewhat underwhelming in terms of the benefits that they've delivered. There is, within industry, a concern that it is, frankly, too close to business as usual for the union, and that it won't result in long-term improvements. Now, there's a lot of water to still go under the bridge before we make that assessment. But in our view, it is only a first step. What we need to do is look at deficiencies in the system that enabled this problem to arise in the first place. We need, for example, to look at, how union, the CFMU in particular, have been misusing right of entry laws, particularly laws around workplace health and safety. And we need to look at reinstating some sort of industry-specific body or watchdog, like the Australian Building Construction Commission, to tackle the specific problems. In our view, there needs to be a properly motivated, empowered body that understands the specific dynamics of this sector. I don't want to get into the politics of whether that body should be reinstated, but there needs to be a properly empowered regulator looking after the specific problems of this sector. But ultimately, our big concern really is that unless we have legislative reform tackling these sorts of issues, we're really just sort of treating some of the symptoms of the sickness. We're not getting to the root causes of the problems in the sector. But one of the other areas where we think there needs to be some meaningful change is in the space of enterprise bargaining. And put simply, we think there needs to be changes made to genuinely reinvigorate the bargaining system. Over the years, decades preceding the introduction of the Fair Work Act, enterprise bargaining delivered real benefits to workers and to employers. It was a system that drove many of our productivity improvements. But, when we saw the introduction of the Fair Work Act in 2009, we then saw the system of bargaining wither as employers increasingly moved away from it. Now, in recent tranches of legislative amendments, the government has tried to reinvigorate enterprise bargaining, but largely that has been through measures that have been designed to give unions greater power to force employers to engage in bargaining. Greater powers to force them to commence bargaining, greater avenues to pursue multi-employer bargaining. What we say there needs to be genuine changes to the system, changes that are genuinely directed at incentivising employees to voluntarily bargain and to engage in the kind of bargaining that results in improvements to productivity and mutual benefits for employers and employees. And one of the obviously, really big barriers to bargaining is the complexity of the system. It is difficult for employers to navigate workplace bargaining, and that's a barrier to employers engaging in it. So we think that there needs to be a fresh look at how we simplify the system, and we think that there does need to be a reconsideration of some of the flawed changes that were introduced in the last tranches of reforms. We need to look at really problematic changes to what's called intractable bargaining, which were changes that give the Fair Work Commission radical new powers to arbitrate the terms of so-called agreements, and changes that unfairly meant that the changes could never result in workers but all unions ever going backwards. And that's a real barrier to bargaining over instruments being used to modernise workplace rules. Separate to that, we think that they do need to have a careful look at the multi-employer bargaining changes that were introduced. Now, these changes were pushed through in notoriously short time frame. They are going to prove deeply problematic over time. We always said this would be a slow burn in terms of realisation of some of these issues. But while we saw the justification being to help workers that historically hadn't engaged in bargaining in sectors such as the care economy, we've already seen them being used to instead push for multi-employer bargaining sectors like mining and the fast food industry, where there really isn't a justification for this sort of change. So look, we do think there needs to be a reconsideration of bargaining in order to deliver much greater capacity for employers and employees to genuinely agree on arrangements at the workplace level.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Brent. So after the election, we'll catch up again to have a monitor and see how our asks are tracking. But I think, as you say, modernising the modern awards, improving the overall system should actually help our members improve their productivity and compliance.
Thanks, Louise.
Thanks.